and the ways in which they engage with women. So the light blue line is women contacted by a party in the 2013 election, drawing on the Herald survey, and men that were contacted by the party. The gap for women is much larger in urban areas than it is in rural areas. And Sole, maybe you can comment on your own work, on what family-centered clientelism looks like and why it matters in this context. But this is sort of both how parties engage and whether or not political workers are working with them. And what I really wanted to underscore in this is that we've actually shadowed a campaign in Lahore in the 2017 by-election to see how this works, what the engagement with political parties is. So we usually say that political actors don't engage with, party workers don't engage with women. Maybe there aren't enough women workers, but a quite extreme case in this one was watching a by-election that was between two women candidates, Dr. Parveen Rashid and Kulsoom Nawaz, and most of the people campaigning and contacting voters were women. That's me right there, very literally shadowing what was going on over here. And so there is contact, but it's the nature of that contact, what messages are passing through, and how are they managing to engage with what, whether or not they're able to speak the language that might be required to mobilize the vote. So there's clearly, maybe it's not just about the contact, but about something else that's happening in these households that we need a better recognition of as well in all of this. But political parties is a major part of that puzzle. It leads essentially to what we're calling in that second paper that I listed at the beginning is the invisibility of women as political citizens in this country. And this is something that came through very strongly in our work. Women, in our focus group discussions, women regularly refer to themselves as being invisible to the state and to political actors. So this graph here shows you as the dark blue line, women who think the Union Council chairperson does not know them, and the councillor that does not know them. And there's a real gap in that engagement, even at the local level. So this was at a time when local governments did exist and were active to some extent in these neighborhoods, and a real gender gap that we're able to see there. So it's a constant focus on what the gender gap looks like. And this also then starts to get us to understand that this space may be very heavily mediated by men. So if that's where the contact is happening, that's possibly also where a lot of the decision making is then happening, and a lot of the decisions around political activities. Other ways in which we think that invisibility matters and manifests itself is that you can see that kind of a gender gap, again, between males in dark blue, women in light blue, and the difference in how interested they are in neighborhood and service delivery issues, in political issues, and in political TV shows. So a real sort of disengagement of those invisible citizens from the political process, and that is essentially sort of the signals that we now have of where we might, and the fact that we do need to re-engage our women. But sort of what is the sense of how appropriate it might be for women to be part of politics? And we see a real difference. So here, each time, and apologies for how small this is, but the dark block here is women, and the lighter gray block is men. And we asked them about how appropriate they think it is for women to discuss politics. So just look at the gender gap in each case and the levels of it. Discuss politics, not that big a difference, but the levels are also high. Attend a rally, neither men nor women think that that's very appropriate. Stand as candidate, more women than men. Become political workers, more women than men think that it's appropriate and okay, but the level is not terribly high. But here, well above 95% of women and 92% men that we talk to think it's absolutely appropriate for women to vote, right? So the constraint that we see in them not coming out is not because there's any kind of a social norm that's attached to women, to that being an inappropriate political activity, even though the other areas may well be considered more inappropriate. But there is a really interesting gender gap to note in attitudes in each one of these cases. But voting, I mean, that's the main thing that you need to hold on to right now for the next just 2 or 3 minutes. is that gap does not exist in voting. But so we think, we know that the political space is mediated by men, but we also have evidence within our own survey then of there being other kinds of gatekeeping, right? So now more and more we're getting to understand that there aren't really sort of huge constraints on women voting, maybe and yet we see those huge numbers, and trying to look now inside the household of what might be happening here, and we realize that there's gatekeeping in other spaces as well that affects women. So 60% of surveyed adult women need permission to leave the house. There is motorbike ownership, but women don't have access to that. So 92% of households own a motorbike, but clearly, as we possibly understand, whether it's a motorbike or a car, the ownership is not usually with women. And a number of other areas that we checked on where we realized that there may be gatekeeping that's happening. So what we now know, I mean, just a very quick summary slide of everything that's gone before I move to the experiment here, is that there is a large gender gap that's fairly exacerbated in urban areas, that is mirrored by a gap in mobilization and political knowledge, that the household and the community, there is a general consensus on voting, and that is not where the issue is, and that there is a sense that there is gatekeeping, that it exists inside households, and that the efforts that we've had, whether it's from NGOs, the Election Commission, or legal instruments that we've had, that it's that it hasn't been able to make a difference. That's not where our answers lie. So what we did in this case was that we partnered with Aurat Foundation and South Asia Partnership Pakistan to run a voter mobilization campaign in 2,500 households in Lahore. And we randomized households to receive one of 4 different types of treatments. The first group is that they received no visit at all. A second group is that a female mobilizer visited and spoke just with women in the household. The third group is that a male mobilizer visited and spoke just with men in the household. And the fourth treatment is that there were 2 separate visits by a man and a woman, a mobilizer and speaking to men and women in the same household. And it's the difference across these that we want to see in terms of what we're interested in, i.e. do more women then come out to vote. This is pre-2018, and we're looking at results of voting in the 2018 election. How do we measure that? We turned up in the 2 days after the vote had happened to check for whether they had the indelible ink mark on their fingers or not. This is largely because of concerns around over-reporting of whether you did vote or not. So we had to rush through this exercise in the first 2 days after that, because our qualitative work had also signaled to us that it washes off very quickly, and it washes off quicker for women than for men because of household chores. So you have to show up fairly quickly if that's the measure that you're going to use of the outcome. What we did in these households was a combination of things. We made sure that they realized that this was a non-partisan exercise. We had a letter from the Election Commission who supported this exercise, so we had that letter with us. We made a 5-minute video that talks about accountability relationships. If we'd had more time, maybe it would have been nice to have seen that. An information leaflet as well as a mock ballot exercise. So it's not the type of message that varies across households. It's really who receives the message inside each household. And the final slide then is just showing you the results. So no effect for women working with women in households and delivering the message only to women. A 5% increase in women's turnout in the 2018 election when we worked with men, only men in the household, and an 8% increase. So given that initial difference of about 9% gap, this is quite a major result of working both with men and women in these households. We think that this creates a framework, and this is why we are going first, is because we want to know where the following papers think they might sit on this framework. And our framework essentially suggests that there's two conditions that might hold to what kind of an impact we can expect from a short-term intervention, and when can we shift norms on issues such as women coming out to vote. And those two conditions are whether the attitudes and norms around the political activity are permissive or restrictive. And as you'll recall, we said voting was generally considered, fell into the permissive group, and that was true for both men and women. And the second condition that we think that holds is whether or not you require men's permission to engage, whether there's gatekeeping or not. And so ours work falls into this space. The activity is constrained by gatekeeping from the way we understand it. Engaging men is necessary, and we were able to see short-term change that came from this intervention. If the activity had not required men's permission, then clearly this is not the sort of intervention you'd require. But if the attitudes were restrictive, then maybe we need to think about different kinds of interventions, and then this is maybe not the space that you want to operate in. So it would be really, I'm going to stop there, but it would be really nice to see if this framework works for the others that are going to speak after this today. Thank you.